The woods went silent first, not the usual quiet of a winter coming on where the birds just leave. This was different. A sudden, heavy stillness that settled over the Kanawha River valley like a shroud. Caleb, ahead of me, stopped mid-step, his rifle lowering. He was a greenhorn, but even he knew something was wrong. The air itself seemed to hold its breath thin and cold, and the smell of damp earth was suddenly sharper, cleaner, as if all other scents had been scoured away. My hand went to the stock of my own rifle, the wood cool against my palm. We had been tracking deer, following fresh signs, but now there was only the vast echoing space between the trees and the sudden terrible knowledge that we were not alone. It was autumn, 1915. The West Virginia hardwoods were ablaze with fire and gold, a last defiant burst before the cold set in for good. I'd seen 100 autumns in these mountains, hunted these valleys since I was a boy. My hands, calloused and hard from years of rifle and axe, knew the feel of every tree, every stone. My dark hair was tucked under my worn felt hat, and my eyes, deep blue and always watching, usually caught every twitch of a squirrel, every distant plume of smoke. Today they caught nothing but this unnatural quiet. Caleb Finch, barely 20 years old, turned a pale face to me. His unruly brown hair was damp with sweat, despite the crisp air. He was still in his slightly too large work clothes, and his rifle, a gift from his father, looked heavy in his young hands. He'd been eager that morning, talking of his wife, Mary, and the locket he planned to buy her with his logging wages. He'd even shown me the small, crinkled photograph he kept in his breast pocket. Now the eager light was gone from his eyes, replaced by something close to fear. "Silas," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. "What is it?" I shook my head, my gaze sweeping the ancient oaks and sycamores that towered around us. The deer tracks we'd been following, fresh and distinct in the damp earth, seemed to mock us now. A buck, a good-sized one, had led us deeper than usual, toward a ridge where the trees grew thicker, older, their branches laced together like the ribs of some colossal beast. We were a good 2 hours' walk from the logging camp, further than I liked to be as dusk began to creep in. The silence pressed in heavy and absolute. No rustle of leaves, no distant call of a bird, not even the hum of insects. It felt like the forest itself had ceased to breathe. Then a shiver went through the canopy, not from wind, but from something else, something unseen, shifting. My eyes narrowed, straining against the fading light. I saw it. Not a full picture, just fragments that my mind tried to piece together, then rejected. A shadow, too tall, too broad, draped across the upper branches of a colossal oak. Then a shift, a ripple in the fabric of the twilight, and something dark, leathery, seemed to unfold and then press back against its body. The color was wrong. Not the bark of a tree, not the fur of any animal I knew. Gray-brown like a moth's wing at rest, but scaled for a thing of impossible size. It didn't move, made no sound, just watched. I couldn't see eyes, not directly, but I felt them. 2 pinpricks of terrible, ancient light reflecting the dying sun. A cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeped into my bones. Caleb made a sound, a choked gasp, and stumbled back against a fallen log, his face pale as ash. His rifle clattered against the wood, forgotten. His eyes, wide with horror, were fixed on the same spot as mine. He had seen it too, or enough of it to understand that what stood before us was not of this world. The creature didn't move. It just watched. That was the worst of it. Not a predator poised to strike, not an animal caught unawares. It was an observer, a silent, ancient thing in its own domain, and we were the trespassers. Its size alone was enough to make a man's blood run cold. 7 feet, maybe more, even hunched against the tree. The moth-like wings, folded tight, hinted at a power that defied reason. Run! I hissed, the word tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. I grabbed Caleb's arm, yanking him upright. His legs felt like jelly, but the sheer terror in my voice seemed to shock him into motion. We turned, not looking back, and ran. We ran like men possessed, scrambling over roots. Crashing through undergrowth, the rhythmic thud of our boots the only sound in the unnerving silence. Every snapping twig behind us, every rustle of dry leaves sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The air burned in my lungs, cold and sharp. My rifle was still clutched tight in my hand, but it felt like a child's toy against the impossible thing we'd left behind. We didn't stop until the distant smoky scent of the logging camp finally reached us, a beacon of human industry in the overwhelming wild. We burst into the clearing, disheveled, panting, our lungs heaving. The camp was a crude affair, rough-hewn cabins made of pine and fir, a large cook tent, a scatter of smaller sleeping shacks. The rhythmic thud of axes and the distant whine of a saw were the usual soundtrack. But as we stumbled in, the sounds seemed to halt, replaced by the stares of a dozen men. Elias Vance, the camp foreman, was by the main cook fire, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. His weathered face, framed by a thick beard, was turned towards us. His voice, a gravelly rumble, cut through the quiet. "What in the devil's name is all this racket?" I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with fear and the burning in my chest. Caleb, leaning against a stack of freshly cut timber, was openly shaking. His face was still ghostly pale under the flickering lamplight. "We saw it," Caleb choked out, his voice thin and reedy. A thing, in the trees, big, with wings." Jed Stone, a burly man with a booming laugh and an unshakable belief in his own strength, stepped forward. His ruddy face was split by a sneer. He was a man who lived by his hands and his axe, which he often carried even when not working, a symbol of his readiness to confront anything. "Wings, you say, boy? Sounds like too much rot gut to me, or maybe you saw a big owl and jumped at shadows." A few of the other loggers chuckled, but a nervous edge was in their laughter. They were men of the woods, but also men who prided themselves on their practicality. Spooks and legends were for old women and long winter nights, not for the cold, hard light of a West Virginia autumn. "It wasn't an owl, Jed," I managed, my voice rough. "It was tall, gray-brown, like a moth, but taller than any man. It just watched us." Elias Vance, his eyes the color of riverstone, fixed on mine. He was a man of 50 years, seen more than his share of hardship in these woods, but his gaze was steady, assessing. He didn't dismiss us with a laugh, not like Jed. He saw the genuine terror in our eyes, the trembling in Caleb's hands. He'd seen men break from a broken leg or a runaway log, but never like this. "Silas ain't one to spin tales," Elias said, his voice quiet, cutting off Jed's next scoff. He walked over to the fire, picking up a tin cup of coffee. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving mine. "What exactly did you see?" I recounted it, the words tumbling out, trying to describe the indescribable. The unnatural silence, the size, the stillness, the terrible intelligence in its unseen gaze. Caleb, recovering slightly, nodded along, adding details of his own, his voice still shaky. When I finished, Elias was silent for a long moment. He stirred the embers with a boot, the sparks dancing upwards into the cold night air. The other men who had gathered closer now shifted uneasily. The boisterous noise of the camp had been replaced by a tense quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "We've had strange things," Elias finally said, his gravelly voice lower now. "Couple of the boys out by the old growth said they heard a sound, a rustle like cloth tearing, but nothing there. Tom Miller, he said he saw a shadow big as a bear move too fast for any bear to move, just outside the camp perimeter last week." My gut twisted. Tom Miller was a quiet man, a hunter like me, not given to flights of fancy. If Tom had seen something, it was real. They didn't make much of it, Elias continued, looking at the fire. Thought it was fatigue, or maybe a bear on its hind legs, but it's been more frequent. And no one's caught hide nor hair of any bear. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of the men. And now you two come back, white as ghosts, talking about a thing with wings. The fear, which had been personal and immediate, now began to spread through the camp, a cold dread seeping into every man. Jedstone's bluster had evaporated, replaced by a grim set to his jaw. He still looked skeptical, but his swagger was gone. "This ain't no ordinary critter," I said, my voice firm. "It watched us. It knew we were there." Elias nodded slowly. "I reckon not. Too many tales, too many strange goings-on for it to be a coincidence. We're deep in these woods, deeper than we've been before." He paused, looking around at the simple, rough-hewn cabins, the stacks of timber, the tools laid out for the next day's work. This camp, this bastion of human industry, suddenly felt fragile, exposed. "We pull out," Elias declared, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "First light. Pack what you can carry. We ain't staying here another night." A murmur went through the men, a mix of relief and renewed fear. Abandoning a camp, leaving behind equipment and weeks of work, was unheard of. It was a concession to something unseen, something that defied their logic and their brute strength. But no one argued. The shared dread, the accumulation of strange reports, and the raw terror in Caleb's and my eyes had solidified into a single chilling truth. Some things in these woods were beyond human understanding, beyond human control. That night, sleep was a distant luxury. The camp was quiet, but it was a different quiet now, a wary, watchful silence. Every creak of timber, every distant hoot of an owl sent a jolt of fear through me. We were committed. We were leaving. And the knowledge settled heavy in my gut. Our true ordeal had only just begun. The woods, once a source of livelihood, now felt like a trap, and we were already caught inside. First light brought no comfort. The dawn filtered through the skeletal branches of the maples and oaks, painting the forest in hues of cold gray and watery gold, but it did nothing to dispel the gloom that had settled over the camp. Elias, true to his word, had the men moving. There was little talk. The usual boisterous shouts and good-natured curses were absent, replaced by the creak of leather, the scrape of boots on frozen earth, and the low, urgent murmur of men packing what they could. We left most of it behind. Tools, spare provisions, the heavy logging equipment that had been the heart of our livelihood, all abandoned. It felt like walking away from a battlefield, surrendering before a single shot had been fired. Each man carried a rifle, an axe, and a meager pack of essentials. Caleb, his face still etched with the fear of the previous night, clutched his rifle like a lifeline. He kept glancing back at the empty cook tent, at the cold ashes of the fire that had offered so little warmth. Elias moved with a grim efficiency, directing the men, his gravelly voice now stripped of its usual authority, replaced by a weary resignation. He led the way, his heavy wool coat a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. Jedstone, axe in hand, brought up the rear with Tom Miller, their usual banter silenced. I walked near Caleb, my eyes scanning the tree line, every shadow a potential threat. The air was cold, thin, and the smell of damp earth and pine was sharper than ever, almost acrid. The silence of the woods, once a familiar comfort, was now an oppressive weight. It wasn't the natural quiet of an undisturbed forest, but a listening silence, a stillness that hummed with unseen presence. We moved slowly, deliberately, each man straining his ears for a sound that wasn't there, a rustle that shouldn't be. The dense canopy, once a comforting roof, now felt like a cage, its branches obscuring the sky, trapping us in a perpetual twilight. We hadn't gone far when Elias stopped. He raised a hand, and the line of men behind him froze. The only sound was the thudding of my own heart against my ribs. He pointed to a patch of damp earth near a cluster of old growth. "Look here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. There were tracks, not the deep, cloven hoof prints of deer we'd been tracking the day before, not the paw prints of a bear or a wolf. These were long, narrow indentations, almost like a foot, but too elongated, too delicate for any man. They ran parallel, two distinct impressions, then vanished abruptly as if the thing that made them had simply lifted off the ground. The soil around them was disturbed, not by a heavy weight, but by something that had brushed aside leaves and twigs with unnatural precision. Jed scoffed, a low, nervous sound. "Just a trick of the light, Elias, or some animal we ain't seen before." "No animal I know walks on 2 feet and then flies away, Jed," Elias retorted, his voice tight. He knelt, tracing one of the prints with a gloved finger. "And no animal I know leaves a smell like this." He gestured for us to come closer. I leaned in and the scent hit me. It was sour, cloying, like stagnant water mixed with something metallic and vaguely organic. It was a smell I couldn't place, a smell that felt wrong in the clean, crisp forest air. It clung to the disturbed earth, a chilling signature. Caleb gagged, turning his head away. "What in God's name is that?" Elias stood, his face grim. "It's been here, watching us." He didn't need to say more. The tracks and the smell were proof enough. The timber watcher had moved from passive observation to active presence. The hunt had begun. We pressed on, the discovery hardening the fear in us, making it less abstract. Now it was a tangible thing, a cold dread that settled in our bones. We kept to the old logging trails where possible, but the watcher seemed to anticipate our movements. We would find small, inexplicable disturbances, a neatly stacked pile of firewood at a long-abandoned trapper's lean-to, now scattered as if by a sudden, precise gust of wind. A canteen dropped by one of the men and retrieved, now found empty, its stopper meticulously placed beside it. These were not random acts of nature or animal mischief. This was a deliberate intelligence toying with us, showing us it was always there, always observing. The days bled into each other, a blur of exhaustion and gnawing fear. The autumn chill deepened, and the brilliant fall foliage began to thin, leaving the woods starker, more open, and offering fewer places to hide. Our resources dwindled. Food was scarce, and the water from streams tasted metallic, as if the sour scent of the creature had seeped into the very earth. Sleep became a fractured thing, taken in shifts, with one man always on watch. Even then, the night offered no real rest. Every creak of timber, every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl became a potential threat. Elias, ever the pragmatist, tried to maintain order, assigning tasks, rationing supplies, but his commands carried less weight. The wilderness and the thing in it had stripped him of his foreman's authority. He was just another man, tired and afraid. Jed, whose boisterous confidence had been a constant presence, grew quiet. His ruddy face became drawn, his eyes constantly darting into the shadowed depths of the trees. He held his axe tighter, not as a tool of work, but as a weapon, a futile shield against the incomprehensible. His swagger had vanished, replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Caleb, meanwhile, became more withdrawn, clutching the small, crinkled photograph of his wife, Mary, in his breast pocket. He would pull it out sometimes, staring at it in the dim light of our meager fires, his lips moving in silent prayer. Tom Miller, the quietest among us, remained stoic. He walked with a steady, uncomplaining gait, his rifle held ready. He would often stop, listening, his head cocked slightly as if hearing something the rest of us couldn't. He didn't speak of it, but his perpetual seriousness seemed to deepen with each passing hour. He was a hunter like me, and he understood the language of the woods, a language that was now speaking of something alien and terrifying. One afternoon, as the sun began its swift descent behind the western ridges, we were traversing a particularly dense thicket of rhododendron and laurel. The undergrowth was thick, thorny, clawing at our clothes and skin. It was slow going, each step a struggle. Elias was in the lead, hacking at the branches with his axe, clearing a path. I was just behind him, followed by Caleb, then Tom, and finally Jed, pushing through the tangled mess. The air grew still. That unnatural silence again, so profound it pressed on the eardrums, hushing even the distant caw of a crow. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I stopped, my rifle rising instinctively. "Elias," I whispered, my voice rough. "Hold up." Elias paused, his axe mid-swing. He looked back, his eyes questioning. "The air," I said, "it's gone still." He nodded, his own senses confirming what mine already knew. We stood for a moment, listening. Nothing. Not a breath of wind, not a rustle, just the heavy, waiting silence. Then a sound. Not a rustle, not a snap. It was a soft, almost imperceptible thump from behind us, followed by a faint, wet drag. It came from where Tom Miller should have been. My blood ran cold. "Tom?" I called out, my voice barely audible in the sudden, crushing quiet. No answer. "Tom!" Jed's voice, though hushed, was laced with panic. "You there, Miller?" Still nothing. Only the silence, deeper now, charged with a terrible certainty. Elias turned, his face pale. Back up, slowly. We began to back through the thorny undergrowth, our rifles raised. Every branch that snagged our clothes, every twig that snapped underfoot sounded like a cannon shot. The rhododendron parted where Tom should have been. He wasn't there. His pack, the one he had meticulously organized that morning, was gone. His rifle, too. But on the damp, leaf-strewn ground, caught in the tangle of roots, lay his axe. The steel blade glinted dully in the fading light. It was lying flat, as if it had simply been dropped, not torn from his grasp in a struggle. And there it was again, the sour metallic scent. Stronger now, clinging to the air around the axe, thick and chilling. It was the smell of the Watcher. Jed stumbled forward, his eyes wide with horror. He reached for the axe, then recoiled. He's gone," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound. "No sound, no fight." Elias knelt, examining the ground. There were no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, no blood. Just the empty space where Tom had been and the chilling, inexplicable absence. Tom Miller, the quiet, dependable hunter, had simply vanished. Lifted. Taken. The reality hit us with the force of a physical blow. This was no legend. This was no animal. This was a hunter, more efficient, more terrifying than anything we had ever conceived. It didn't stalk with roars and claws. It moved with a silent, deliberate intelligence, picking us off without a sound, without a trace. Tom had been just feet away, and none of us had heard a thing. "Run," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Don't look back. Just run." And we ran. We scrambled back through the thicket, heedless of the thorns that tore at our skin, the branches that whipped our faces. The game of cat and mouse was over. The rules had been revealed, and they were simple. We were the prey. The woods, once a source of livelihood, had become a labyrinth of dread, and the timber watcher had just claimed its first blood. Our retreat had turned into an outright flight, a desperate, linear dash for survival against an enemy that moved in silence and left only absence in its wake. We ran. We scrambled back through the thicket, heedless of the thorns that tore at our skin, the branches that whipped our faces. The game of cat and mouse was over. The rules had been revealed, and they were simple. We were the prey. The woods, once a source of livelihood, had become a labyrinth of dread, and the timber watcher had just claimed its first blood. Our retreat had turned into an outright flight, a desperate linear dash for survival against an enemy that moved in silence and left only absence in its wake. We didn't stop until the light was gone. The forest plunged into a deep, impenetrable black. Our lungs burned, our legs ached, and the thorns had left streaks of blood on our faces and hands. We huddled beneath a thick overhang of rock, a shallow cave that offered little protection from the biting cold, but promised temporary concealment. Elias, despite his exhaustion, stood guard by the entrance, his rifle clutched tight. Jed sat slumped against the rock, his face buried in his hands, the axe lying forgotten beside him. Caleb, silent, stared into the darkness, his hand pressed over the pocket where Mary's photograph lay. I watched the woods. The silence had returned, but it was a different kind now. Not the heavy, waiting quiet, but a vast, empty expanse that seemed to mock our frantic flight. It spoke of a hunter that knew no hurry, that understood the inevitability of its prey. The sour scent, faint now, still clung to the air, a phantom reminder of what had happened and what awaited. Sleep was impossible. We shivered through the night, listening to every creak, every distant snap. The cold ate at us, seeping into our bones, promising a slower, colder end if the watcher didn't find us first. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, we were already moving. There was no discussion, no plan beyond a desperate push south, towards the distant promise of the Kanawha River, towards the edge of this ancient, terrible wilderness. The days that followed blurred into a relentless march. We moved with a single purpose: forward. We rationed what little food we had left, a few strips of dried jerky, a handful of hardtack. Water was drawn from icy streams, its metallic taste a constant reminder of the pervasive cold. The forest was no longer a familiar landscape. It was a hostile maze, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a whisper of unseen wings. The watcher didn't show itself, not directly, but its presence was a suffocating shroud. We saw signs. A freshly broken branch high in an oak, too thick for any animal to snap. A deer carcass, picked clean, bones scattered across a mossy bank, but with no marks of wolf or bear, only the unsettling precision of a different kind of predator. There was no blood, only the telltale sour scent, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the chill air. It was a message. I am here. I am always here. Jed's composure had shattered. His booming laugh was a distant memory. He moved with a jerky, agitated energy, his head constantly swiveling, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He still clutched his axe, but now it was less a weapon, more a talisman against a terror he couldn't comprehend. He muttered to himself, sometimes curses, sometimes pleas, sometimes just incoherent sounds. He saw things in the shadows, heard things in the wind that weren't there, or perhaps were. His once steady gait became a stumbling shuffle. Caleb, too, was fading. His youthful eagerness was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. He no longer spoke of Mary, just clutched her photograph, his thumb rubbing over the worn image. He walked with a slump in his shoulders, his rifle held loosely, his focus lost somewhere beyond the trees. He was a ghost already, walking in a nightmare. Elias, though outwardly stoic, showed the strain. His weathered face was etched deeper with fatigue, his gravelly voice now often a hoarse whisper. He still tried to lead, to make decisions, but the options were always the same: keep moving, keep running. His experience as a foreman, his knowledge of the woods, counted for little against an enemy that defied all natural laws. He looked at me often, a silent understanding passing between us, a recognition of the impossible burden we now carried. Our supplies dwindled to nothing. We abandoned packs, anything that might slow us down. The cold was a constant companion, gnawing at our fingers and toes, threatening to turn our flight into a frozen crawl. The trail we followed became less a path, more a desperate scramble over rocks and fallen timber. The terrain grew rougher, the forest denser. We were pushing into a part of the mountains Silas had only heard tales of, a wild, untamed region where the logging camps dared not venture. One afternoon late in the week, we came upon a ravine. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, perhaps 50 feet across, with sheer rock faces dropping into a dark, rushing creek far below. A single, ancient oak, its roots clinging precariously to the far side, had fallen across it years ago, forming a natural but treacherous bridge. Its trunk was slick with moss and damp, and the wind funneled through the chasm howled mournfully. "No other way around," Elias rasped, pointing to the endless thicket of laurel on either side. "You're too slow." I nodded. The trunk was wide enough, but the moss was a danger. A slip meant a broken neck, or, worse, the cold, dark waters of the creek. "One at a time," I said. "Keep low. Don't look down." Elias went first. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a man who understood the risks, his heavy boots finding purchase on the slick bark. He made it across, steadying himself on the far bank, his chest heaving. I followed. The wind tugged at my clothes, and the roaring of the creek below filled my ears. I kept my eyes fixed on the far side, ignoring the dizzying drop. The wood felt alive beneath my feet, groaning with my weight. I reached the other side, my muscles trembling with effort, a cold sweat on my brow. Then it was Caleb's turn. He hesitated, looking down into the churning water, his face pale. "I don't like heights," he mumbled, his voice thin. "Keep your eyes on me, Caleb," Elias called out, his voice a strained whisper. "Don't look down. Just focus on putting one foot in front of the other." Caleb nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the log. He moved slowly, his body hunched, his hands gripping the mossy bark. He was halfway across, his back to Jed, who stood frozen on the near side. That's when the air went still. Again. Not a whisper of wind, not the rush of the creek. Just a sudden, profound silence that swallowed all sound, all sense, leaving only the beat of my own heart hammering in my chest. I saw it. Not clearly, not fully. Just a shape, impossibly large, unfolding from the dense canopy directly above Caleb, gray-brown, like shadow given form, like the underside of a monstrous wing. There was a faint, wet rustle, a sound like silk tearing, and then it dropped. Caleb screamed, a single, raw, desperate cry of pure terror. It happened too fast. One moment he was on the log, the next he was gone, pulled upward violently into the dark curtain of leaves. His rifle clattered against the log, then tumbled into the ravine, its fall echoing briefly before being swallowed by the roar of the creek. I saw his silhouette against the last sliver of evening light, impossibly high, struggling, kicking, his arms flailing, then a sickening crack like a dry branch snapping, and his cries choked off, replaced by a gurgling gasp. He went limp, his body hoisted swiftly, silently, deeper into the canopy, until he was nothing more than a memory, a terrible, lasting imprint on the darkening sky. The silence returned, even heavier than before. The wind picked up, rushing through the ravine as if it had only paused to witness the horror. The creek roared its indifference. Jed stood on the far side of the ravine, transfixed, his mouth agape. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, all bravado stripped away, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of a man utterly broken. He stared at the empty space above the log, then back at us. His eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the last fading light. He began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that rippled through his entire body. "Caleb?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, a child's voice. No, no, he's gone. Elias stood beside me, his rifle lowered, his face drawn. He didn't speak, didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the spot where Caleb had been, then slowly, agonizingly shifted to Jed, the weight of this new loss, the brutal, witness-taking, pressed down on us. Caleb, the heart of our dwindling group, the young one with the photograph of his wife, was gone, just like Tom. Silent, swift, irreversible. "Jed," Elias called out, his voice hoarse but firm. "You got to cross, Jed, now." Jed didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes still wide, fixed on nothing. He was gone too, in a way. His mind had broken with Caleb's last cry. "He ain't moving," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He can't." Elias looked at me, then back at Jed. A terrible understanding passed between us. We couldn't go back. Not for Jed. We couldn't risk the Watcher coming back. We had to keep moving. The creature had shown us its patience, its terrifying efficiency. It had waited for a moment of vulnerability, for the crossing, for the separation. It had planned this. "We go," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of mercy, but filled with a desperate pragmatism. "We can't wait." It was the hardest choice I had ever witnessed, harder than any I had yet made, to abandon one of our own, alive but lost to terror, to the unseen thing that hunted us. But the alternative was clear: stay and become another absence in the woods. We turned our backs on Jed, on the empty space above the ravine, on the memory of Caleb's final scream. We walked away, deeper into the darkening woods, leaving Jed stone to his terror, to the chilling silence, to the relentless pursuit that would now fall entirely upon his shattered mind. Every step was a fresh agony, every rustle of leaves a reminder of the impossible choices we were forced to make. The woods pressed in, cold and indifferent, and the only thing that kept us moving was the desperate, linear hope of finding an end to this nightmare, an escape from the relentless hunter that claimed us one by one. Our bodies were broken, our minds frayed, but we kept moving. We had to. Our bodies were broken, our minds frayed, but we kept moving. We had to. The night after we left Jed, the cold bit deeper than before. It wasn't just the autumn air. It was the cold of absence, of what we had done, of what we had seen. Elias and I walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our heavy boots, the ragged rasp of our own breathing. We didn't speak of Jed. We didn't speak of Caleb. There were no words for it. The woods were a dark, unforgiving maw, and we were two bits of gristle caught between its teeth. Every shadow was the Watcher. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I kept my rifle ready, my finger hovering near the trigger, though I knew it was useless. What could a bullet do against something that moved like a whisper and saw in the dark? We pushed on, driven by a primal need to put distance between us and the ravine. Elias, despite his age, kept pace, his jaw set, his eyes darting into the impenetrable darkness. His heavy wool coat was torn, smeared with mud, but he moved with a grim determination. We were heading north, towards the faint promise of a logging road, a path back to a world where such things didn't exist, couldn't exist. Sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford. We would stop for an hour or two huddled against the base of a thick oak, shivering, our minds racing, then force ourselves back into motion before the cold could truly set in, before the silence could become too heavy. Each step was an effort. My legs ached, my muscles screamed, but the image of Caleb's struggling silhouette, the memory of Jed's shattered face pushed me forward. The days blurred into one long, agonizing march. The forest itself seemed to conspire against us. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwined, blocking out the sky. The ground became uneven, riddled with hidden roots and slick rocks. The air was always damp, carrying the scent of decay and the sour metallic tang that I now associated with the Watcher's presence. It was closer now, I could feel it. A prickling on the back of my neck, a sense of being perpetually observed. We knew it was hurting us, not directly, not with overt force, but subtly, guiding us through the most difficult terrain, pushing us towards some unseen destination. It played with us like a cat with a mouse, toying with our exhaustion, our despair. The realization was chilling. It wasn't just hunting, it was orchestrating. One afternoon, a cold, gray light filtered weakly through the thick canopy. We stumbled into a clearing, a small rocky plateau overlooking a sheer drop. Below, perhaps 200 feet down, a churning river snaked through the valley. It was the Kanawha, but far from any familiar crossing, far from any road, and the plateau ended abruptly in a treacherous cliff face, a jagged wall of shale and loose rock, impossible to descend. We were trapped. Elias stopped, his breath ragged, his eyes scanning the impossible terrain. "It's got us," he rasped, his voice devoid of hope. He leaned heavily against a boulder, his face drawn and pale, his shoulders slumped, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then I heard it, a familiar, desperate bellow that echoed through the trees behind us. You hear me?" Jed. He burst into the clearing, his clothes torn, his face smeared with dirt and dried blood. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, fixed on some unseen horror in the trees. He still clutched his axe, the blade dull, but he swung it wildly, erratically at the empty air. His beard was matted, his hair a wild mess. He was a man utterly unhinged, driven by a terror that had consumed him. "Jed!" Elias called out, a flicker of something, perhaps pity, in his voice. Jed didn't seem to hear. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the dark edge of the forest where the trees met the clearing. You bastard!" he screamed, his voice raw, cracking. "Come on, come and get me, you thing!" He took a stumbling step forward, raising his axe high, his body shaking. He was looking at something we couldn't see, something that stood in the shadows, patient and terrible. The air went still again. Not a breath of wind, not a rustle of leaf. The only sound was Jed's ragged breathing, his low, animalistic growl. Then it moved. Not a visible shape, not a definite form, but a ripple in the fabric of the shadows, a shift, a sudden deepening of the darkness, and the sour scent, unmistakable, filled the air. Jed roared, a sound of pure, desperate defiance, and charged. He swung his axe, a wide, desperate arc into the empty space. The steel glinted for a fraction of a second, then vanished as he made contact with nothing, or something that wasn't there, not truly. There was a sound then, a wet, tearing sound, like heavy cloth ripping, and a choked cry from Jed. His axe flew from his hand, spinning end over end before clattering against a rock. Jed stumbled back, his hands grasping at his chest, his eyes wide with a final dawning horror. I saw a dark, viscous stain bloom on his shirt, spreading quickly. He sagged, his knees buckling, and then, in a terrifyingly swift motion, he was pulled backward, silently, into the shadows. There was no struggle, no scream, just the swift, final disappearance, the rustle of leaves that quickly faded, leaving only the profound, suffocating silence. Elias and I stood frozen, our rifles still useless in our hands. Another one. Gone. Just like that. The Watcher had herded Jed, used his terror, and then taken him silently, efficiently. It had orchestrated his end just as it had orchestrated Caleb's, just as it had orchestrated Tom's. And now, it was our turn. The sour scent was stronger now, closer. I could feel its unseen presence, a weight in the air, a pressure. We were next. I looked at Elias. His face was a mask of grim resolve, all weariness gone, replaced by a steely glint in his eyes. He understood. This was it, the end. But I had been studying the cliff face. Not just the sheer drop, but the way the rock had fractured, the way the ancient roots of a long dead pine clung to a narrow ledge. It was impossible, yes, but impossible was all we had left. Elias, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the eastern side, there's a fissure, old, barely visible. It might lead to a path, a game trail. Used to be one there years ago for goats. Elias followed my gaze. His eyes narrowed, searching the treacherous rock face. He saw it too, a faint, almost imperceptible line in the shale, a scar on the cliff. It was suicide. But he didn't hesitate. Lead the way, Silas, Isur, he said, his voice firm, his resolve unshaken. We go. We moved, not running, but with a desperate, controlled urgency towards the narrow fissure. The air behind us seemed to thicken, the silence to press in. I knew it was watching, allowing us this final, desperate gambit. The fissure was barely wide enough for one man, a jagged crack in the rock that descended at a steep angle. The handholds were few, the footing treacherous. Elias went first, his heavy frame scraping against the rock, dislodging loose shale that tumbled into the abyss below. I followed, my rifle slung across my back, my hands raw as I gripped the damp, cold stone. The descent was agonizing. Every muscle screamed in protest. We moved like ghosts, silent, focused. The only sound the scrape of our boots, the ragged rasp of our breathing. I could feel the Watcher above us, a presence on the cliff edge, observing our desperate scramble. It was in no hurry. It knew we were trapped, knew this was a gamble, a last, futile effort. Midway down, the fissure opened onto a narrow ledge, no wider than my shoulders. Below us, the river roared, a dark, churning ribbon. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, and then I saw it, a dark shape, impossibly large, silhouetted against the dying light at the very edge of the cliff above us. It was watching. Its wings, folded against its back, seemed to absorb the last vestiges of light. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. Two burning points of ancient, terrible intelligence fixed on us. Elias saw it too. He paused, his body pressed against the rock, his face grim. He didn't speak, he just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible odds. We had to move. The ledge continued, wrapping around a sheer outcropping, then narrowing even further, eventually leading to a path that snaked down to the riverbank. It was a goat trail, barely there, but it was a path. We pressed on, our bodies aching, our minds screaming. The Watcher above us remained still, a dark sentinel against the twilight. It didn't pursue, not directly, it simply observed, letting the terrain, letting our own exhaustion do its work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the riverbank. The cold water rushed around our knees, dark and powerful. We stumbled, half crawling across the slick stones, the current tugging at our legs. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We just kept moving upstream, away from the cliff, away from the silent, watchful horror. We walked until the first faint streaks of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the river in shades of gray and silver. We walked until the trees began to thin, until we saw the distant, almost imperceptible line of a dirt road, a road that promised a return to the world of men. When we finally stumbled out of the woods, days later, we were barely recognizable. Our clothes were shredded, our faces gaunt, our eyes hollow and haunted. Our skin was scratched and bruised, our hands raw. We were more animal than men, driven by instinct, by the raw, desperate will to survive. A small logging crew just beginning their day found us. They stared, their axes lowering, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. They offered us water, food, warmth. But their eyes held a question, a silent judgment for the madness they saw etched on our faces. The officials came. Clean-shaven men in pressed suits, their expressions polite, condescending. They listened to our story, to the impossible tale of a moth-like man, of men vanishing, of a silent hunter in the trees. They nodded. They took notes, their pens scratching softly on paper. They spoke of delirium, of wild animals, of the psychological toll of the wilderness. They suggested we had endured a terrible ordeal, a bear attack perhaps, or a fever dream brought on by exposure. They didn't believe us. How could they? The world of men had no room for such things. The logging camp by the Kanawha was abandoned. The company tried to resume operations a few months later, but the men refused to go back. Whispers had spread. The camp foreman, Elias Vance, and that quiet tracker, Silas Blackwood, they'd seen something. Something that turned men's hair white and stole their words. The equipment rusted. The cabin slowly surrendered to the encroaching forest. Nature reclaimed what industry had tried to take. Elias and I, we never spoke of it again, not directly, not to each other, not to anyone else. What was there to say? The words were inadequate. The truth was too terrible, too alien. We carried it inside us, a cold, heavy stone in our guts. We were survivors, yes, but the victory was hollow. Our escape came at an unbearable cost. The lives of Tom, of Caleb, of Jed, and the irreversible shattering of everything we thought we knew. I still live in these mountains, though I stay far from the Kanawha now, far from the ancient places where the trees grow too tall, too dense. I still hunt, still work the land, but the woods are different for me now. They hold a deeper silence, a more profound mystery. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the eaves of my cabin, I still feel it, that cold, watchful presence, that prickling on the back of my neck. I know it's there, always, patient, permanent, waiting. The forest stands ancient and indifferent, its secrets kept. The leaves still turn to fiery gold in autumn, still fall silently to the damp earth. And somewhere, deep within its untouched heart, the timber watcher watches. It waits for the next encroachment, for the next trespass. It always will.